Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for class for Wednesday, the 11th. And what we are talking about is the Gothic tradition. We had begun last class by talking a little bit about Stephen King and his seminal text, Danse Macabre, The Dance of Death. And in a very colloquial and informal way, which is very much Stephen King's style, he talks a little bit about the history of the Gothic and some of his perspectives about the way that the Gothic can be used from a symbolic or a metaphorical perspective. And his work is based in part on people like Lovecraft. And that's what today's reading happens to be about, supernatural horror and literature, which was an essay written by H.P. Lovecraft. You can tell immediately that H.P. Lovecraft's writing style is quite different than Stephen King's. While Stephen King is very informal and colloquial, H.P. Lovecraft is the exact opposite. He's very academic and he tries very much to be an Anglophile. So he's trying to mimic the speech patterns and sometimes even the spellings of the British, which you can see in his writing. Supernatural horror and literature is an essay, but it's a long essay, so it can appear as a book in and of itself, which is sold by Dover. That was the edition that I had ordered for our class. But you'll see that there I was also able to find a link for supernatural horror and literature so that you could access that for free online. And of course, all of the texts are on reserve in the GCC library. In terms of Danse Macabre, I was unfortunately unable to find the link that I usually use that's easily accessible. I was able to find something on the Internet Archive, but you do have to register into the Internet Archive in order to be able to access their works. But again, you can get Danse Macabre in bookstores, on Amazon, and there's a reserve copy in the GCC library. And while Stephen King is talking about things like famous spooky tales like The Hook, which is something that usually is shared around campfires, where a man with a hook is terrorizing a couple who happen to be parking and making out on a weekend evening, as an example of perhaps the basis level of horror. He also talks a little bit about the highest level of horror, which is not only just symbolic, but it also is not necessarily and kind of in your face gross out. Instead, it is much more subtle and it builds tension. And we'll be seeing examples of all of the above over the course of the semester. H.P. Lovecraft in supernatural horror and literature is also another famous Gothic author, just like Stephen King. So we will be revisiting King in terms of his works at the ending of the semester, just like we will be revisiting Lovecraft about midway through the semester with some of his short stories. According to Lovecraft, and I had indicated that because Lovecraft is a hard read, that you may not necessarily be able to understand all of his references, nor should you try to, because he is very well read in the Gothic tradition. But I wanted you to get more of a feeling of his perspective about Gothic literature, or what he calls supernatural horror in literature, that which defies natural explanation. And I've tried throughout the course of the semester to get texts that have at least the possibility of supernatural elements. You remember, though, that we talked about that the Gothic oftentimes has ambiguity associated with it, so that individuals who want a more naturalistic explanation rather than a supernatural explanation can embrace that. According to Lovecraft, fear is the oldest and strangest emotion. And it makes certain sense based on what King talked about as well, is that death, because the fear of death and what happens after death are closely in line. You even want to think about the opposite, birth. Birth begins, I would assume, with fear. Not that any of us remember the birthing process when we came into the world, but you think about the first thing that a baby does is cry. So the idea of the unknown, uncertainty, and danger. And that, of course, is hardwired into us with our hunter-gatherer days. Was one of the ways that we were able to stay alive is by listening to our fears. And our primitive forefathers, of course, had fears that perhaps are genetically embedded within us. So if you happen to fear the dark, and ironically, I don't like the dark, even though I do like the Gothic tradition, and Stephen King himself talks about how he doesn't like the dark either. So that's something that he and I both share. Because you can't necessarily predict what kind of threat exists in the dark. Now, some of the things that Lovecraft does is that he provides us with definitions, macabre, for instance. And this, of course, was a term that King used in Danse Macabre, that which is gruesome, horrifying, grotesque, as opposed to weird. And from Lovecraft's perspective, that's the supernatural, that which is unearthly or uncanny. Freud has some really interesting theories about the idea of the uncanny, if you've ever heard of the uncanny valley, something that seems real and yet is not real at the same time. So it has enough similarity to reality so that it looks real, but there's just something that's slightly off, that's disorienting. And that a reader of the weird tale, the macabre tale, the supernatural tale, the Gothic tale, whatever language you want to use, must have imagination. It makes sense. All readers need to have imaginations to be able to walk into a fictional world. And they must have a certain level of detachment from everyday life. They must be able to, oftentimes this is a term we use in literature, suspend disbelief. Now, in chapter 1, even though this is just an essay, the essay is divided up into chapters. This is Lovecraft's introduction, and he talks about how important the atmosphere of dread is in terms of the Gothic. This is something that I had talked about last class as well. I think Halloween is a great example, where Halloween is oftentimes about atmosphere, and about getting into the mood. And I think that's very true. Going all the way back to the Castle of Otranto, where some of the conventions of the Gothic tale were established, dark and creepy passageways and mysteries and things of that nature. And Lovecraft also talks about that there is a long literary tradition of using these elements, whether we call them weird or supernatural or Gothic. And I had mentioned this in my last video as well. Beowulf. So if you know anything about Grendel or Grendel's mother, who's a much bigger and badder monster. Dr. Faustus. You may or may not be familiar with this play, written by Christopher Marlowe. So we're talking about the English Renaissance, and this is actually what I did my graduate work in. And Dr. Faustus happens to be the story of a scholar named Faustus, who's acquired unlimited knowledge, and because of that, he's bored and dissatisfied. So he makes a pact with the devil to get the knowledge that is forbidden to man. And of course, Faustus has to live up to his end of the pact, which is after a certain amount of time, he's going to relinquish his soul to the devil. And as the play progresses, we see that, well, Faustus basically wastes whatever limited knowledge the devil gives him. To be quite honest, the devil doesn't really give him that much in exchange for Faustus's soul. But Faustus initially has these grand ambitions, like he wants to be able to learn how to make men live eternally. Keep that in mind when we're reading Frankenstein. And instead, he ends up basically playing parlor pranks, becoming invisible and moving chalices around in the church to frighten the clergy and so forth. And then by the ending of the play, spoiler alert here, ultimately Faustus has to relinquish his soul. And throughout the play, Faustus has justified not changing his behavior, either because he's got enough time to repent at the end and God will forgive if ultimately someone shows a certain amount of regret, or Faustus is so evil that regardless of how sorry he is for his past deeds, ultimately he can't be forgiven. So therefore he may as well live it up. And at the ending of the play, when the devil comes for his due, Faustus's soul, at that point Faustus tries to repent, too little too late, and he's dragged into hell. And this is a great literary example of not only the weird or the supernatural, it's something that's going to be very important when we read Frankenstein, which I'm hopeful that you've started reading now. So I indicated that these first two couple classes are introductory classes before we actually get into the Gothic texts themselves. And we begin with Frankenstein. My hope is that as we start Frankenstein, you would have completed it in its entirety so that you can begin the next text. I know that sometimes life isn't ideal, but you want to try your best as much as possible. And of course, with all of these texts, especially the ones that are so important in popular culture, we'll talk about film adaptation as well. Macbeth. So if you know anything about Macbeth and the Three Witches, it's a wonderfully spooky tale. So the first Gothic novel, again, as I had indicated, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, 1794. And I've got a link there from Project Gutenberg, again, if you wanted to look at that particular text. Poorly written, but it does give a sense of how the Gothic tradition began. And the convention of castles and villains and persecuted heroines, a hero, strange atmosphere with fog and trapdoors, creaking hinges, strange lights, things of that nature. In chapter 5 of Supernatural Horror in Literature, the aftermath of Gothic fiction, referencing texts that we will be reading over the course of the semester, such as Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And, of course, Chapter 7 talks about Lovecraft's most favorite Gothic author, someone that you might have heard of before, Edgar Allan Poe. Lovecraft is a huge fan of Poe, talking about how Poe has a standard of realism and a use of psychology that's never really been seen in the Gothic before. And while we aren't necessarily going to be reading everything in the Gothic tradition, we will be reading the major texts so that when we get to Poe, you can see whether or not you agree with Lovecraft's assessment about Poe's standard of realism and use of psychology. We're going to be reading texts such as The Mask of Red Death and The Fall of the House of Usher, both which Lovecraft references. Lovecraft then goes on to talk about the weird tradition in America. So something like Henry James's Turn of the Screw, which I used to assign actually in this class. It's just a question of how much time do we have to realistically read the texts that are on our reading list. So I decided to delete it. But it is a great ghost story. And the English ghost story is a genre in and of itself that's known very much both for its ambiguity but as well for its subtlety. We'll revisit the idea of the English ghost story as the semester progresses, but perhaps you've heard of a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Gilman and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And if you know anything at all about The Yellow Wallpaper, it utilizes many of the same sorts of techniques. And then in chapter 9, Lovecraft talks about the weird tradition in the British Isles. So think about something like Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Again, another excellent text that if we had the chance, we would read. Or Dracula, which we do have the chance to read, and we'll talk a little bit about the origins of Dracula. So according to Lovecraft, the best horror tale has basically naturalness, convincingness, artistic smoothness, skillful artistry and technique, craftsmanship, experience, psychological knowledge, exotic atmosphere, and a supernatural element. So you'll see that what I have done is underneath the first section, for section number 2, I have indicated Frankenstein. And I have that through Gutenberg.org. But again, you can certainly reference that in print copy. I prefer print because it allows you the ability to annotate easily. And I wanted to talk a little bit before we transition into Frankenstein about the first paper. Now, the first paper is not going to be due for a little bit of time. So the idea is that you have some time to consider as we begin reading the Gothic text. Again, I don't think of these introductory texts by Stephen King or Lovecraft as necessarily texts that you would be writing a paper on. Instead, you would be working on papers starting with Frankenstein, which is what we are beginning. So Paper number 1 is going to be very similar to paper number 2. Paper number 1 will be due approximately midway through this semester, but I have rolling deadlines so that starting very soon, you can begin thinking about and even submitting paper number 1. I will also be talking about some of the conventions of how to go about writing as the semester progresses. And that said, I'm hopeful that this is review from your previous English classes, but that paper number 1 should probably be addressing the earlier set of readings in the semester. And then paper number 2, which is going to be due at the ending of the semester, would be addressing one of the readings from the latter part of this semester in approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it should be, in order to defend your thesis, the position upon which you are basing your paper. And because it is a critical paper, you're not using outside resources. I spent a little bit of time last class talking about plagiarism and artificial intelligence. I really would prefer that you use your own critical analysis based on what you've learned from your classmates. As I had indicated that in terms of the discussion forum questions, which appear at the ending of every class, and you have 48 hours to respond to those questions. But if you need additional time, just let me know. But that you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses. And that would give you a good idea of what it is that we would have talked about in class. And you might note that I will respond to all of you. So I responded to your first discussion forum question where you introduced yourself. So thank you very much. It was very nice to hear a little bit about your background. And in terms of my background, I was born and raised in New York City, and I attended college at the University of Rochester in upstate New York. I thought it would be very quaint to experience what they call real winters. And while it was quaint, it was also cold, very cold. I learned that it basically meant snowfall much of the academic year. But I adjusted, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, when I was absolutely positively certain I was going to be a lawyer. So you never know how life might change over the course of time. Took a Shakespeare class, fell in love, and then realized that really what I wanted to do was not practice law. It was instead to talk about literature and to teach literature. So I went to graduate school, though this time I went to a warm climate, Los Angeles, UCLA, and there was no snow. Oh, there were earthquakes and there were mudslides and there was drought, but there was no snow. And I majored in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, specifically Christopher Marlowe, whom I was mentioning earlier. And then I began my teaching career and realized that, well, I was missing the winter after all. So I began applying to positions. Just about anything on the East Coast, in my mind, would suffice. And there was a little school by the name of Greenfield Community College that had a position open. You know how this story will end. This was in 1993. It's hard to believe how long ago it was, where I flew out for an interview and was very impressed that Greenfield lived up to its name, a place with fields that were green. And where I lived, there was drought and fields were brown. And we talked a bit about my transition and that ultimately I had experience with winter, both in New York City and also in upstate New York. And I was assured that the winters in Massachusetts were not that bad. And while that might be the case over the last several years, that certainly was not the case in the 93-94 academic year, which was one of the worst winters on record with snowfall and ice and cold. It was just brutal. But I stayed through that, teaching English classes, but I've also branched out to communications classes as well, and personal communication classes too. So that's a little bit of my story. So what you would have seen is that I would have responded to all of you, just like I will be responding to you with your last attendance question, which was about fear. And what do you find to be frightening? Today's attendance question, by the way, which is also at the bottom of our notes, is going to be, how do you define the Gothic and why? And again, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer here. We talked a little bit about how Stephen King defined it. We talked a little bit about how Lovecraft defined it. But ultimately, I'm more interested in your thoughts and perceptions, your reasoning. While you're not required to respond to your classmates, you are certainly encouraged to. but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So that should put us in a pretty good place to begin Frankenstein and begin thinking about paper number 1. So I go back to what I had started, paper number 1 and paper number 2. And you can find the handout for paper number 1 and paper number 2 in our syllabus and other documents folder. So you'll see in the video below under the section 3, I have a quotation. That happens to be one of my favorite quotes that I'm basing both papers on. The quote happens to be from a very famous author that you've probably heard of before, Emily Dickinson. And the quote reads, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted." And I just love that quote. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. So I thought I could use that as the prompt for paper 1 and paper 2. So now I'm going to go through the actual written assignment that I have posted in the syllabus and other documents folder. So that might be something that you might want to print up as a hard copy. That both of these papers, paper 1 and paper 2, will be critical papers. In other words, you should not be consulting outside resources. Paper length, again, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is approximately. So you can choose the topic listed, or you can write on your own topic. So if you didn't like the topic that I chose, you can create your own, but you do need to get that topic approved by me beforehand. So paper number 1 would be addressing one of the earlier works of the semester. So that begins one of the earlier Gothic texts of the semester. So that begins with Frankenstein, which we'll be spending some time with. Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then paper number 2, probably one of the later works of the semester, which would be Lovecraft, The Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist. But there is a note here. Dracula straddles both the first and the second part of the semester. So you can think of Dracula as a possibility for the beginning of the semester, or you can think of Dracula as a possibility for the ending of the semester. You just wouldn't want to have 2 papers written on the same text. And the topic that I've given you is about Emily Dickinson's quote. Examine how the following quote by Emily Dickinson, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted," applies to the text you have selected for your paper. Now, I know that I'm giving you this topic before we've actually talked about any of the text, so it probably won't make a whole lot of sense now, but it will as the rest of the semester unfolds. So you can just put this in the back of your mind as you are beginning with Frankenstein and as you proceed throughout the course of the semester. But regardless of whether you use my topic or you create your own, you need to have evidence and details to support your arguments. So you need to have reference from the text. And we'll talk about that as the semester progresses. And at the bottom of that handout, I have a quote that says that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, "Have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible?" So this is a tall order to say things clearly, concisely, believably, gracefully. So the earlier you start, the better off you are. You all have the option of rewriting that first paper, and it is the revision due at the ending of the semester. So you can see the first paper is a kind of learning exercise as we begin to talk about Gothic texts and also some of the conventions of writing. The second paper, probably there wouldn't be time to rewrite it. It's due at the very ending of the semester. But if you could get it in early enough, we could perhaps negotiate a possibility of a revision. But this gives you an idea of what to contemplate as we begin reading Gothic texts. And we start with Frankenstein, so I'll do some introductory information about Frankenstein. And again, for the attendance question, which is where I will end today's video, which is due on our class discussion forum on the 13th, Friday the 13th, no less, is how would you define Gothic literature based on everything you've read and everything you've heard thus far, and why? So I'm looking forward to reading your responses. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class by talking about, well, Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.